So before I do that, let me just begin. We have a standard practice of trying and getting everybody involved. And therefore, let me just see if I can get you people involved. This thing says people can see your app. I'm assuming you can still see me and you can still see the app. All right. So the question is, how many of you have at the moment written a paper? Among everybody who's in this audience, how many people have actually written a paper? So if there is nobody saying anything, that means nobody?
No. So
Yes, sir.
a lot of them papers.
Yes, sir.
All right. So many of you have. That's answered the question number one. Many of you have. So the next question is, how many of you have had a problem when you've been asked to decide who's going to be an author? Has there ever been a problem? Should we have him as an author? Should we not have her as an author? Who's going to be the first author? Have you ever had those issues?
No, sir.
Well, that's interesting. If you haven't had issues, that means you must have a very well sorted out department or a very well sorted out faculty. Otherwise, that typically becomes one of the common issues that we have in most academic institutions. All right, so let's just see why we have a problem. Writing is not new. The first journal was actually published over 350 years ago. It was the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. I'm not sure Dr. Piyushani has shown you this in the introductory talk 2 or 3 days ago. But this is something which has been in existence for a very long time. Hang on a second. I don't think you're seeing my full slide. Seeing only a part of it. Are you seeing the whole slide or just a part of it?
Yes, sir. Only a part of it.
Yeah, that's what you kind of appear to me. Let me just see if I can modify this. I don't know why this is happening. Just give me 1 second. Okay, I cannot actually understand why it is showing you only a part of my slide. Maybe I'll go to sharing my screen rather than sharing my slides. Just give me 1 second.
So Rajeev, what's happening?
So what's happening is that it's picking up only a part of my slide and not the whole thing. So I'm going to now change to try and share my screen.
We are able to see the full slide.
Okay, now you'll see the whole thing.
Yeah, we are able to see the full slide.
Right. Okay, perfect. So now we can see the whole slide. So what I was talking about here is that writing is not new. It's been there for years on end, and we've had about a 350-year history of writing scientific journals. And what we need to understand is, why were journals ever produced? Why did people start writing? And when we look at that, the first concept of writing began with the concept of altruism. People wrote because they had something new that they wished to communicate to other people in the same field. So for example, when penicillin was discovered, there was an important discovery that you needed to inform everybody so that they could benefit their patients. The treatment options were limited, and therefore you wanted to inform. And the quickest way of informing people was to put all these writings together and disseminate like a newspaper. So the concept was altruism. You wanted to help people because discoveries were few and far between. You wanted to do good. You wanted to prevent harm. Over the years, it's become a standard dogma. And if you go back and look at all the research methodology courses that any one of you would have attended, you would have been told levels of evidence or the levels of importance of evidence. And the published word is the only word that is important. Your teacher's knowledge, your guide's knowledge is important for you to form a base, but it doesn't become evidence unless you can find a source where it was published. And therefore, if anything that you believe or wish to do wasn't published, the general assumption is it did not happen. That's the concept of why writing happened. And therefore, writing became an essential part of scientific practice in all fields of science. We're only talking of medicine here, but this is true in all fields of science. But over the years, this has changed. Today, the principal reason why many people write is purely because they need it for academic progress. You need it when you want to apply for faculty positions, when you wish to get promoted, when you wish to write for grants. For all of these requirements for you to do well in your chosen profession or career, you now need to write. You need to have a publication. For you to be recognized among your peers, you again need a publication. There are dozens of graduates in any specialty today. Something as small as urology, where I graduated about 25 years ago, 20 years ago, there used to be just about 30 or 40 of us in a year. Today, there are 300 plus graduates in urology every year. And it's become progressively more difficult for an individual to stand out among his or her peers. And the best way for people to stand out is to have a published paper. Once you have a published paper, you get invited to speak. Once you speak and you speak well, you build up a body of your presence. You get more invitations, you get more patients, even if you're in practice. So all put together, the pressure to write has become much, much greater. And this is why we have changed from a philosophy, from a principle where we were writing only because we were altruistic and we wanted to help our patients, to a situation today that we are now writing to benefit each one of us. We are now writing to benefit man and not to benefit mankind. The biggest benefit that comes from writing comes actually to the author. Therefore, the author has now become an extremely centric body in what gets written. Who is the author? How many authors are there? What are their contributions? What institution do they belong to? What is their past track record of writing? Unfortunately, all of this has become critically important to judging the value of your research. And therefore, the centrality of the author in publications is now, in the last 50 years or so, being captured in multiple documents. So this is one of the earliest documents which talked about authorship. And what it basically says is you will not allow your name to appear as an author on a manuscript unless you have some authoritative knowledge of the subject, you have participated in the research, and you have labored in weighing every word or quantity written in that manuscript. Now, this language has been simplified because it's very difficult for people to understand this. And so the ICMJE, I'm sure you've heard of what the ICMJE is, has simplified this one statement to defining what we mean by an author. An author is somebody who must take responsibility. That is now the key word. Responsibility for at least one part of the work, and must also be able to identify others who have taken responsibility for other aspects of this work, and must also be confident in their co-author's integrity. And I'll come into a little bit of discussion on why each one of these things is important. Since statements are often difficult to interpret or put into practice, the ICMJE has gone a step further, and they have now made a set of 4 criteria. Every author must fulfill all 4 criteria. It is not that you fulfill one or you fulfill another. You must fulfill all 4 criteria to be eligible to be called an author. And what are these 4 criteria? The first criteria is that you must have made a substantial contribution to the idea behind the work. So either the thought process behind the research idea, gathering the data, analyzing data, or interpreting the data. So some part of scientific input into that work. That is your first requirement. The second requirement is that you must have contributed to drafting of that article. The third requirement is you must have approved what is being submitted, and I'll explain a little bit about each one of these things as we go along. And the next criteria, and this is the most recent criteria, it actually came in only in 2013, is that you have to be agreeable for the entire body of work. Not only are you responsible for the part where you have done the work, but you also have to be responsible for the integrity of the rest of the work. Now let's discuss a little bit about what each one of these things mean and how they become important. You could very well say, let's look at an example where, let's say, since I'm a surgeon, I decide that I want to look at, let's say, a genomic marker for prostate cancer. I don't do genomics. All I do was identify the patients, draw a prostate biopsy, send it to the lab. The lab does the genetic markers, sends me the genetic markers report, and I publish it. There are 2 or 3 other people who've helped me on that work, and I've got their names as authors. Now, let's say 2 days after the article is published, somebody writes a letter to the editor saying that this work is fraud. The genetic markers that you have shown are useless. Such type of markers don't exist. The work that has been done is really not good. Now, the editor will obviously question all of us. I, as an author, as a surgeon, am also responsible. And the immediate question is, why am I responsible? Nobody is questioning the fact that these were prostate cancer patients. Nobody is questioning the fact that I took biopsies. I have a written report from the lab which says the following genetic markers were found. Where am I at fault? What have I done wrong? The fact is, I am liable for the entire manuscript. And the reason is very simple. When I send my sample to a particular lab, I am required to ensure that that lab is actually capable of doing the work I'm expecting it to do and has the integrity to do good work. Because when I publish this paper, it may influence practice. And somebody sitting in North America has no idea what my lab looks like. They read a paper that comes from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. Let's assume that they have some faith in this institution. Maybe they've heard of me because it's being read by urologists. Maybe they have faith in me. They read the paper and they decide to implement it into their practice. They have no idea what my lab looks like. Who is the person who's supposed to see whether the lab is good or bad? It's me. It's my job to ensure that everybody who's collaborating on my project does a good job. Therefore, I cannot get away tomorrow by saying, I only collected the samples. I don't know what the lab does. Maybe the lab just does a sync test. It just drops things and writes anything. Why am I responsible? This is why I'm responsible. Because I am the only person, or we, the authors, are the only people who know what is actually being done, even if we aren't actually doing it ourselves. Let's assume that I'm supposed to do, let's suppose we're doing a randomized trial and I'm doing it with one of my residents. And somebody comes up tomorrow and say that the randomization was wrong. I can very well claim that I did not do the randomization, my resident did it. But whose job is it to teach the resident the right thing? Whose job is it to ensure and check intermittently that the resident is doing the right thing? Maybe he doesn't know, he's a younger person. He doesn't know what's right and what's wrong. Whose job is it to ensure that everything that's gone into this paper is correct? It's my job as an author. The same thing would apply to my genomics person in the lab. Let's assume that the primary audience was the genetics people, and the lab is the more dependable, or it's being published in a genetics journal. Everybody who reads the paper would expect the person they trust or the institution they trust to have taken the essential steps in ensuring the integrity of the data, even if they don't know me. The genetics person cannot come up and say, I don't know who took the samples. I don't know whether they were prostate cancer. I don't know whether it's benign prostate. I just got the sample. The urologist said it's prostate cancer, so I believed him. But that's not enough. If you believe an individual, you must have reasons to believe it, and then you have to stick with them. That's why the criteria of authorship have become critically important. And when we go back to the previous slide where we had said about reading the paper and approving the final version, that's again a very common issue that comes up. Let's say an original draft is made of the manuscript. Typically, one person will write the paper. The first draft is written by one person. There are at most 2 people writing it, even if there are 8 or 9 authors. Assuming that there is a problem tomorrow, and there were 2 or 3 iterations of the draft, you changed, somebody made some additions, somebody took something away, there were reviewers' comments and you changed. And parts of the manuscript have now changed from what you had originally seen. You can't go back and say, I only saw the first draft. I haven't seen what has been submitted to your journal. They've changed it. Well, they can't change it without your approval. The minute you say, I want to be an author, I sign off saying I want to be an author, I have to accept responsibility. And that's why this whole idea of responsibility has become extremely important. Again, I'm going to come back to a couple of slides a little later, which will explain why this has become so crucial and why do we keep harping on this concept of responsibility. So if we know who authors are supposed to be, we must also understand two different types of people who shouldn't be authors but are listed as authors. If authors don't fulfill the criteria of authorship, they're called guests. And those who do fulfill the criteria of authorship but aren't given the credit on the authorship byline, they are called ghosts. So then the question is, why do we do this? Why do we have guests? Why do we have ghosts? And why is it a problem? So again, I'm going to take a pause. Let's see if any one of you is willing to participate in a discussion. Is anybody willing to give an idea? Why do we get guest authors? Anybody among the audience who wants to volunteer an answer? Why do we have guest authors on a manuscript?
To provide an opinion on a specific part of it.
Okay, so what you're saying is you brought on a guest because they've given some contribution to a part, but then yes, then maybe they do contribute. They've given you scientific input. If you let them read the paper, they would probably qualify as authors. So when we say people don't deserve to be authors but are given a name, why do you think that happens?
Seniority.
10 seconds before sorry, go ahead.
Seniority.
Yes, why are you afraid of saying it? So there are
So sometimes for the ease of getting the work done or to conduct the study.
Yes. Anybody else? All right, both your answers are absolutely correct, and I'm going to give you a third one also. The commonest explanation is that this person is my senior. If I don't get his name onto the paper, he's not going to let me work, and therefore he has to come on. So that is typically one of the criteria of guest authorship or gift authorship. If I don't get my HOD on it, I'm not getting promoted. So that is unfortunately the commonest answer that's given. The second common answer is this person did help me. So let's say it's a statistician, he did help me. He doesn't fulfill the criteria of authorship, but I'm grateful and I want to recognize his help. That's actually not somebody who deserves authorship. We'll talk about acknowledgements. That's somebody who deserves an acknowledgement for helping you, but maybe doesn't deserve the entire authorship because they don't fulfill all four criteria. The other reason people often bring on guests is because their names help sell the paper. So we all know rejection rates are between 80 to 85%. For any good journal, the rejection rates may even be higher than 90%. We also know that editors are humans. Editors also look at where does the paper come from, who is the author, what is the standing of this individual, how much do I trust this paper? And authors also know this. So sometimes they would want to bring a big name onto their authorship byline, that if I get this big guy's name onto my paper, it's quite possible my paper will have a easier passage and might get accepted easier. And therefore they wish to bring on gifts and guests onto the authorship. So these are 2 or 3 of the common reasons why people bring on guests. They're all wrong, and we'll talk about why they are wrong. Now let's talk about ghosts. What do you think ghosts are? Why do people not get their name even though they deserve it? Volunteers?
Limitation of authors, number of authors.
Okay, that's one reason. Good. It shouldn't be a reason for anybody who deserves to be an author. Just because the journal says you can put only 3 names isn't a reason. If you write to the journal, they will allow you more. But that's one possible reason. Yes. Anything else? All right. Now I'll give you an example. Maybe that will help you understand. Let's assume that you read an article in the New England Journal of Medicine. This is a randomized controlled trial done by a top level researcher at a top level institution. The study has been done really well. There is really no doubts about the ethics of the study, the quality of the research, the genuineness of the data. It's actually a beautifully done study. There is really no doubt about it. And the data then suggests that the new drug that they are they're comparing drug X versus drug Y. And they say that drug X is better than drug Y. Most of us would generally tend to believe that drug X is better than drug Y, and we would like to try out drug X. Assuming that everything was excellent and we had a great study, we would probably say, yes, okay, drug X looks better. It might even be cheaper for all you know, and let's try drug X. We would be favorably inclined towards drug X. Anybody disagree with that? Okay, I'm assuming nobody disagrees. If you do, you can put up your hand. But let's assume that next week another study appears in the New England Journal of Medicine. Again, very similar to the first one. There is really no question about the quality of the research or the integrity or the ethics. It's truly, genuinely a good drug. I'm not hiding anything here. There are no hidden stuff here. Everything is pretty good. But this says that drug X is not better than drug Y. Now, when we read the two papers, our general impression would be, well, maybe it's good, maybe it's not good. I'm not really sure. It looked good, but I have another study which is just as good, which says it isn't good. And therefore, I would probably wait for a study or two more before I decide whether it's actually good or not. So I'm going to be a little equivocal about the study, about this drug. Is that how most of us would respond? I'm assuming it is. I haven't seen anybody say no, so I'm going to move on. Now let's assume that 1 week later, a newspaper article appears which says that in study 1, the lead author owns the company which makes drug X. What is our response going to be?
It has to be in the conflict of interest.
Carry on.
In the declarations, in the conflict of interest, it should be there in the article. That's the.
Okay, it wasn't there.
Then the integrity might be in question.
Right. You responded absolutely rationally. That's how all of us would respond. I would have liked to see this in the conflict of interest. It wasn't in the conflict of interest. And let's assume it was in the conflict of interest. In either case, our trust in study 1 immediately would drop, particularly in light of study 2, which would reinforce that study 1 is probably not all that dependable. This is a natural human response. The minute you see somebody benefiting financially from that research, you automatically start to question it. You believe that something is possibly wrong, or it may not be as good as it seems. And when another study appears against the first study, you become even more convinced the first study didn't deserve it. But just look at what happened. I began by saying that study 1 was really brilliantly done. There was nothing wrong with it. It was truly a brilliant piece of research. Just because the person benefits financially from it, we are not willing to trust it. We give up everything about its quality simply because the individual benefits financially from it. Now, this human response, and this human response is based on fact. You're not wrong. I have further slides. If we get time for it, I'll show those to you, which will prove to you that you are right in questioning the validity of that result. But the fact is, the person who wrote that study also knows this human response. He knows that if I put my name as an author, I will also have to fill up a conflict of interest form. The minute I fill up the conflict of interest form, the readers know that I am the owner of the company, and they will immediately not believe in my drug. I know my drug is good, my research is excellent. Just because I am being an author on that paper, the trust on my paper or my drug goes away. So many of them would actually keep their name off the authorship. This is called ghost authorship. And unfortunately, although it doesn't happen in as stark a circumstance as I've just described, what I've described is typically theatrical. It doesn't happen in as clear black and white terms. The grayish ways in which it happens is some pharmaceutical company approaching a young faculty member, approaching a young researcher, giving them some piece of data. They build up some trust, they give up some piece of data, they say, we have some data, we don't have anybody to write it, can you analyze it for us? You analyze it, it looks good to you, Then they come up and say, we don't have anybody to write it. Can you go ahead and write it? And you are happy and you write it. This is what brings in ghost authorship. People with interest, with conflicts of interest, keep their names off the authorship byline because it prevents the value to their paper and they become ghosts. This is why ghost authorship is a big issue. And the reason why ghosts and guests both are a problem is because we talked about trust. Remember the crucial thing about medical research. Let's say I'll give you another example. Let's say you go to the market to buy a box of chocolates, a box of expensive chocolates. Let's say it's a 10,000 rupee box of chocolates. It's supposed to have 10 chocolates of 1,000 rupee each. You go there, buy it, you come home and you suddenly realize that one of them is spoiled or two of them are spoiled. They're expensive chocolates. What are you going to do? You're going to actually probably go back and ask the shopkeeper to take it back or pick up a fight or ask for a refund or whatever. You're actually going to check what existed in that box, and if you did not get what you paid for, you'll pick up an issue. On the other hand, when we look at research, when we look at published paper, nobody cross-checks. You say, I looked at 1,000 subjects, I gave drug X and I found it was better than drug Y. You publish that paper, two or three people publish the same paper. Within a week down the line, drug X becomes the standard of treatment. Look at what happened in COVID. The way hydroxychloroquine went from being the best to being the worst to we don't know. Remdesivir being the best to being the worst to we don't know. What we write makes massive changes, not just in patient care, but often in finances, often in reputations, and everything depends upon what we say, but nobody cross-checks. Whoever went and checked whether that 1,000 patients actually got remdesivir? Whoever went and checked that hydroxychloroquine was ever given to those patients? We don't. We never cross-check. We trust the authors to have written the truth. We only look at biological plausibility. We only look at possibility. The reason those two research papers were withdrawn were because they didn't look possible. It didn't appear possible that so much data could have been gathered. That's why they were withdrawn. But otherwise, we don't actually go and cross-check. On the other hand, we were checking just 10 chocolates. That's why responsibility and trust are the keystones of scientific publication. And that's why authors or authorship becomes central to judging the value of a paper. You have to have responsibility for what you put in there. Now, again, I remember I seem to be many would believe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill. It's not a big deal. It is a big deal today. And again, just the last 1 year will tell us how we need to depend upon publications to manage our patients. The last 1 year of COVID, from knowing nothing to knowing something, to knowing wrong things, to doing good things, to doing worse things, to still not knowing anything, has run the entire cycle that scientific publications have run in 350 years. When we were looking for the first published paper, what is this virus? What does it do? How many days is it incubating? How long am I infected? Just 1 year ago. This is exactly what used to happen when cholera was discovered. How is it caused? Nobody knew. Maybe it's that hand pump. That's all we knew. So in that last 1 year, we have learned the importance of publications and the importance of authorship. Why were we not trusting the MedRx pre-press servers? Why did stuff that was coming out of China looked at with a little bit of a doubt? Trust. Having authors who don't qualify to be authors creates experts who don't actually deserve to be experts. They then sit on panels and give advice. You've had urologists, GI surgeons, general surgeons giving all kinds of advice about vaccines. Do they really deserve to be doing that? We create non-experts by allowing people's name to go on papers. And of course, there's money in it. There's tons of money in it. An extension of this whole concept of guest authorship, unfortunately, is more immediate to us. Thesis writing. This is something each one of us is involved with, either as a student or as a teacher. This is something I picked up from the hostels in the institute about 10 years ago. It still happens regularly. The prices have gone up. The minute you come in, there is somebody who's offering to write for you. Simply because thesis is assumed to be a necessary evil, just has to be tolerated and move on, and therefore there are people who are willing to do it for you. This is outright cheating. This is effectively ghost authorship. And it extends even further. These are emails which every one of us will get. I'm sure you guys have also got them. Offering to either write a paper for you, or if you have published a paper, they will pay you to write a paper for them. Forget about the data. Nobody cares where the data is or whose data it is. We will write for you. This is the importance or the problem that comes with authorship. So all other people whom you're grateful to, people without whom you may not have been able to write your research, people who help you get the funds, data collection, your boss, everybody is useful. You're right in assuming I couldn't have worked without them, but they're not authors. There is a specific provision in every manuscript where you can give recognition to these individuals, and that's called acknowledgement. So acknowledgements should be given for people who've only given you technical help, writing assistants, supervisors, data collection, data entry operators, language editing only when you've acknowledged that somebody has helped me write the paper, financial support. All these people who don't fulfill the criteria that we talked about for the ICMJ should only be acknowledged and not become authors. And again, of course, if you're trying to acknowledge somebody, you can't really be acknowledging them by bending over backwards and then twice over just to say, he's such a nice person, he's such a great person, he's such a great surgeon, he's helped me everywhere, and I want to acknowledge him, and then also put his name in the authorship also. The concept of contributorship is something a little more detailed. Many journals will now ask you to specify what each individual did, and that is often useful both to you and to your co-authors. So the roles are defined. If there is a problem, everybody's role is pretty clearly defined, who did what. A journal may publish the contributorship, may not publish the contributorship. It is extremely variable. Now let's talk about another important problematic area in authorship, and that is who comes where. So typically, and this is by convention, this is not by any written rule, the first author is generally considered to be the person who has done the maximum amount of work for that paper. So it may be a junior person, but it's the person who's done the maximum amount of work. And if you're writing a thesis, it's typically the student whose thesis is being written. That's the person who's typically the first author. The concept of a corresponding author for a journal or corresponding author is simply somebody who's writing back and forth to the journal, submitted the manuscript, made the changes. But by convention, the corresponding author is the person who's done the overall supervision. So let's say in a lab, there are 5 PhD students. Each student may write a paper and be the first author, but the overall supervisor, whose general body of work it is, would generally want to be the corresponding author and may very well be the last author. And I'm assuming a significant number of people in the audience are now faculty. And as you grow more senior in your faculty positions, you will progressively find greater degree of respect coming to you if you move towards the end of the byline. If I see a professor submitting a case report as the first author, I immediately look back and see where is this manuscript coming from. Because for a professor to be writing a case report as the, or even an additional professor for that matter, writing a case report as the first author would mean either the case report is so phenomenally unique and this person has done so much great work that he expects to describe a syndrome or a sign which will be recognized by his or her name based on this case report. Or the junior resident was so pathetic that he did not even write a case report, and therefore the senior guy decided, I am not even going to let you be the first author because you haven't even written it. Other than that, I would really find it difficult to justify a senior person coming on as the first author, certainly in a case report and most often on a case series also. So as you become more senior in your academic careers, try shifting yourself towards the end of your byline. So this is the bottom line on authorship. When you want to become an author, and everybody wants to become an author, check that do you fulfill the ICMJ criteria. We see maximum amount of problems with authorships only when authorships haven't been discussed at the beginning of the research. Whenever you start a collaborative research or you start research where 2 or 3 departments or 2 or 3 senior people are involved, discuss it upfront, who's writing the paper, and let it be very clear what the authorship order has to be. If there are multiple authors, try and get written approval from everybody even before you start. And if you have a conflict of interest, make sure you disclose it. Disclosure is the best policy. It lets everybody know what every individual has done, and therefore they can judge for themselves where credit is due. The commonest places where we see conflicts on authorship are in collaborative work. So for example, there's a case report where somebody in medicine saw something interesting, referred to somebody in the lab, they did some interesting tests, got some radiology, got a surgeon involved, got a pathologist involved. Now everybody wants to write. And it's not uncommon. We've had the same case report being submitted by 2 or 3 different groups of people, each believing he or she owned the case. And then that gets them into trouble. If the same thing has been submitted by more than one person and we find that out, everybody's in trouble. Therefore, the best policy is discuss it upfront before you submit anything. This problem also comes in retrospective analysis of departmental data. Let's see, today you want to analyze how many radical prostatectomies were done in your department in the last 5 years. You pull out all the data, but you yourself have done only 2. The other faculty in your department have done 100, 150. Their data is also there. Among the entire body of work that is being submitted, you've done the pulling out work, but you've only done 2. How do you then decide the authorship? So these are issues that need to be discussed upfront before you even start writing your case report. So are there any questions? Otherwise, I will take you through a case. Anybody has any questions on authorship? Any case you want to discuss? We are happy to do that. It's rather your problems that we discuss rather than I give you a pre-prepared case. Okay, I seem to have 0 questions. So I'm going to move on to a case that is pre-prepared. So this is a very typical scenario that happens in any clinical academic setup. A is the head of a clinical department, B is his new student, C is the head of a laboratory, D is her new student. A asks B to think of a thesis and B decides that whether I want to check whether a certain level of serum markers are elevated in a particular condition. Now the markers are not done in their own lab, they have to go to the laboratory department to get the markers tested. So the 2 heads of departments speak to each other. C looks at the proposal and says, it's a good proposal, but I think we should do a different test. The test that you are proposing, what A proposes, is not right. There are new techniques now. We've got a new kit, we've got a new machine. Let's look at this marker with using this new test. They both agree, and she says, I'm going to put one of my PhD students to help your researcher do it. So B writes the protocol, they submit it and get IRB approval. It needs some money, so A has to apply. The student can't get money, the faculty applies and gets money. B, now this is the primary student, recruits the patients, collects and analyzes the data. The samples that he draws, he sends to the lab of C, where D is the PhD student. He analyzes the lab and gives his reports. Now, when the data is all available, A unfortunately can't write English very well, and therefore wants the help of a friend E to write the paper because his own language skills are very limited. They get together and they write the paper. A, that is the head of the clinical department, reads the paper and says, I'm not convinced that your statistics are right. He says, go and get your statistics done from the statistician. So they go to the statistician is F. And F then analyzes the statistical data and they put together this whole paper. So who are the authors? Any guesses?
B. All A, B, C, D.
A, B, C, D, no E, no F.
B should be the first author.
Okay. What about authors?
Followed
B
by
is the
D.
first author.
Yeah.
B and D. D as
D.
in the lab PhD.
Second author. Lab PhD, yes, sir.
All right. So B is the first author and the lab PhD is the second. Anybody else who should be an author?
So who gets the funding and
So A.
approval?
Biostatistician should be the
Okay.
last author.
You want the biostatistician also?
I guess last
Sir, the
F.
person giving
Okay, so you want-
ideation should be the author. Person giving
All right.
ideation should be the author. A and C both.
Okay. So A, C, B, D. What about E?
D.
The guy who did the
He
language
has
thing.
helped in writing the paper to B. So he or she should be ideally.
Should
He
be an
can be
author, should not
acknowledged.
be an author.
He can be acknowledged. Who helps in writing?
Right.
E and F should only get acknowledgements.
All right. So E and F should only be acknowledged. A, B, C, D
And
are
the
the
head of
authors.
the head of the laboratory should be acknowledged.
All right. So A, B, D are the authors. C, E, and F are acknowledged. Are we reaching a consensus? All right. Now let's go and look at what we can do and what we cannot do. What do you think the ICMJE would do? Do you think that guideline helps you, harms you, hurts you? Let's first look at the criteria. We'll forget about the fourth criteria. The fourth criteria primarily talks about responsibility. We'll assume everybody accepts responsibility. Our criteria that ICMJE gives are very straightforward. You have to fill at least one in each one of them. So let's first look at what A has done. A is the head of the clinical department. So what has A done so far? Has A contributed?
Yes, sir.
sir.
Where?
Sir, he gave the ideation
Okay,
and
excellent.
funding also. Funding also.
So funding unfortunately doesn't become one of the criteria. Funding is something you're grateful for, but funding unfortunately doesn't find space here. But concept of design is that, I mean, I accept, most of us will accept that A at least has done this. Now to become an author, what more should A do? This is not enough. You haven't tick marked one check marks in every area.
Critical input.
Correct. So this is not difficult. If you write the paper, whosoever writes the paper gives it to A and says, please look at the paper. Have I done a good job? Can you revise it? He can. And finally, once you've got the final draft ready, he should be able to give you the final approval. And therefore, A fits the criteria, right? A becomes an author. Now let's look at B. What has B done? B is the actual clinical student.
Data acquisition, data
Okay. What else?
drafting of manuscript.
Excellent. So B has at least done data acquisition, interpretation, and drafting. May or may not have contributed to concept and design, but certainly has done the other ones. So can he or she be an author? Relatively easy, you see. Once you've done this part, all you have to do is approve the final version and you'll fit into the ICMJE criteria and you become an author. So A is an author, B is an author. Now let's look at C. What has C done?
Sir, A and C both did ideation work.
Okay, good. Design. So what I'm trying to explain here is how easy it is to justify authorship. The ICMJE criteria are not restrictive. They don't prevent you from becoming an author. They just force you to do a few things to become an author. They force you to read the paper. They force you to approve it. They don't prevent you from becoming an author, but they just tell you that if you want to be an author, you must do these things. The other important thing here is it's not about the amount of time spent on the research that decides whether you should be an author or not. Let's assume that the research was done the way A had originally planned. They did a sample biomarker without consulting C or without taking C's inputs. It's quite possible that the marker that they were testing was obsolete. And when they wrote the paper and submitted it, the first reviewer would have said, you used an obsolete technique. You should have used a newer technique. So all that C did was say, don't use the old technique, use the new technique. That's all. She may have done nothing more. But just that one small piece of knowledge information that she gives is enough to change the entire importance of that paper. And therefore, her contribution may very well have been just half an hour in a 1 or 2 year thesis, or 1 hour. But that is enough to decide that this paper is worth publishing or not. And therefore, it is not the volume of work done, how many visits you made to the lab, how much data you collected that decides whether your contribution. Your brain may have contributed in just 15 minutes, but that itself was so crucial to the research that you deserve to be an author, assuming, of course, you're willing to fulfill everything else. You can't say, I've just done this, I'm not going to do anything more. That's not enough. You must read the paper, you must tell us whether we've interpreted the test results correctly, and you must also approve the final version. Now let's look at the lab student in the PhD lab student. Does she qualify somehow?
Data interpretation.
Excellent. Again, data acquisition and interpretation. And this is where the biggest amount of conflict comes in. Let's assume you drew a blood sample, sent it to the lab where they put it in an automated analyzer and gave you the levels of hemoglobin and sent it back. Would that also deserve an authorship?
No, sir.
Because that is data acquisition.
No, sir.
Why not? You sent it to radiology, every patient got an X-ray. Everybody you've operated got an X-ray in the post-op period.
They are not specifically putting effort for this using a separate technique. It's just part of their.
What you're operating or what a surgeon is operating is also part of a daily life. All right, you're right. I'm just trying to play the devil's advocate here. Every one of you is giving the right answer. I'm just trying to draw you out by playing the devil's advocate. What you're saying is absolutely right. Input has to be more than manual work. You can't simply say, I got a sample, I ran it through my lab, I printed out a report, I gave it to you. You have to have knowledge of what you are doing. You have to be contributing to the research that is being done. Only then do you qualify to be an author. And the same thing holds true for surgeons. Let's say research is being done. I give you the example of somebody collecting previous data of 10 years and publishing it. Everybody must, let's say there are 10 surgeons in the department. Each one of them may have done, somebody has done 5 cases, somebody has done 50 cases. When the case series is written, let's say it's a 100 case series, there are 4 surgeons who've done 5 cases each. Should they also be authors on it? They've contributed to the number. The answer is maybe or may not be. Just because you've contributed to the data acquisition doesn't make you an author. Are you going to provide some material inputs to the research? Are you answering the research question? Is your knowledge, is your insight being used to answer the research question? Are you contributing to the discussion? All that is important before you can claim to be an author. Just because you also contributed 4 patients from your OPD into this series of 1,000 patients doesn't make you an author if you don't have any specific contribution to what the paper is all about. That's why adding the critical inputs is important. Your knowledge is crucial to the subject, even if you've done 1 case. But the discussion that you've brought in, the thought that you've brought in, highlights what we're trying to say in this paper. You probably have a greater input than somebody who's done 5 times the number of cases. That's why data acquisition alone, excuse me, will never be enough to qualify somebody for authorship. Now let's go on to E. E is the person who helped you write the paper. How does he or she qualify? Qualify, doesn't qualify. This is the person who wrote the English part of it.
So only drafting and revision. The second.
No, sir.
So it does not
Any other
qualify.
inputs? Okay. Right. So typically you have two types of help in writing. One is called language and editing help, where the person who's coming in to provide help helps improve your writing. And there are even commercial services available for this, who will help you improve the language, improve the grammar, improve the presentation. But they don't bring any knowledge into it. They don't help you interpret the data. They don't help you analyze it or think. They simply write it nicer. They clean up the language, they put it better. Such help does not qualify to be an author. On the other hand, it's possible that E, your friend or your colleague, is just as smart as you are or in the same field as you are. You take the data to him or her and she says, I think you've got it all wrong. I think you're analyzing it completely wrongly. Let's analyze this versus this. I think your interpretation is wrong. Let's analyze it in this manner. And all of a sudden, that person may actually be bringing in interpretation. Again, the concept would not be about how much time he or she has spent, but what is the value of that input to what I'm saying in this paper. If I was going to say this biomarker does not help diagnose this disease, by looking at the data, she says, yes, you're right, but then look at these 5 sub-analysis that I have done, and I think you have something here which should be relooked at. Or this was a confounder. You haven't looked at this confounder in your analysis. I think you should look at this confounder and your results will change. So all of a sudden, although she had nothing to do with it to begin with, just in the area of drafting the manuscript or revising the manuscript, he or she does interpretation, which is crucial to what is being said in that paper. And even at that stage, that individual can qualify to become an author. Right, let's look at the last criteria. The last person was the statistician. Now that you've understood the theme that I've been working on, you would probably understand that I can either make him an author or not make him an author. If he does something which is routine, all he's done is a chi-square test or run an ANOVA on your data and given you an ANOVA readout, probably no scientific input, probably doesn't even know what research you have done, doesn't even know what drug A or drug B are. All he's done is looked at 2 groups of data, run an ANOVA, given it to you, told you it is P is less than this, end of story, doesn't know anything more. Doesn't deserve to be an author, should only be acknowledged. On the other hand, just like we talked about E, maybe looking at your data, he says, I've analyzed it like this, but I think you're wrong. I think you look at this confounder, modify this analysis, bring in this kind of an analysis, give me data here, and I will relook at it. And all of a sudden, a dead paper has come alive because of the science and the knowledge that the statistician has brought into that paper. Then that statistician also deserves to be an author, of course, providing that person is willing to accept responsibility for the primary data, trusts you, believes in your data, and is willing to contribute. Therefore, what we've learned from the ICMJE criteria are that they're not restricted. The ICMJE criteria are just a set of guidelines which force people to do the right thing. They tell you if you want to be an author, fine. There are numerous ways in which you can be an author. The guidelines will not prevent you from becoming an author, but you have to do these things. If you do these things, claim authorship. If you do not do these things, you will not be an author. So somebody who fulfills all those ICMJE criteria, if they don't do it, only B would be an author. But if they do everything else, then all of them will qualify to be an author. So I've reached the end of my time. I've also reached the end of my presentation. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them right now.